Good morning. I'm Jim Taylor, and welcome to Voices of Alzheimer's webinar this morning on AAIC feedback. We're going to talk about the recent research developments in Alzheimer's that were reviewed with 19,000 attendees last 3 weeks ago at AAIC, the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, which gathers annually the most outstanding research clinicians and advocates around the world and reviews the last year's exciting developments in Alzheimer's and related dementia research. I'm Jim Taylor. I lead Voices of Alzheimer's. We're almost 3 years old, and our mission is to be sure that the voice of the patient is heard and respected in all matters of regulatory policy and research, and have a seat at the table. This morning, we're extremely fortunate to have two outstanding experts join us to talk about AAIC. A longtime and great friend, Deborah Kan, who is the founder and editor of Being Patient, and a more recent and terrific friend, Ben Tiede, who's doing terrific work that he'll share with us at CEO and I Foundation for Alzheimer's. I didn't get that right, Ben. You can correct me. Deborah, will you take a minute and introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Jim, for this opportunity. So my name is Deborah Kan. I'm the founder, as Jim said, of Being Patient. Being Patient is a news and community organization and website to inform people on the science of Alzheimer's, keep them updated. We talk every week to experts on science, treatments, and care. And most uniquely, as much as we're interviewing the experts, we're also interviewing people with a diagnosis to truly understand that first-person perspective.
Your turn, Ben.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Tiede. As Jim mentioned, I lead the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's, which is a corporate roundtable that connects our parent organization, Us Against Alzheimer's, with the business community to look at ways that we can address some of the gaps and barriers to getting back access to care in Alzheimer's disease.
So Ben's going to tell us what we heard in English at the conference. And Deborah's going to help us understand what's that really mean for me as a patient or a loved one of somebody living with Alzheimer's related disease. And this is kind of a unique opportunity, and I love these webinars because we get great people on here, and I get to learn from them as well, because sometimes I'm embarrassed to ask some of the stupid questions I should already know the answers to. So you have a chance this morning, listeners, to put your questions in chat, and we'll relay those at the end of the program or close to the end and get the expert answers on there. So don't hesitate, please. Okay, we're ready to jump in, team. Here we go. One thing I've got a note here to ask about. Deborah, do you have a personal connection to the disease, to Alzheimer's?
Yes. When I founded Being Patient, I was an editor at the Wall Street Journal. I'm a journalist and have been for many decades. And when my mom got her diagnosis of Alzheimer's, it led me down this path. I didn't really expect to quit my job. It was actually a job I really liked. But I realized that information on the ecosystem of science didn't really exist. There wasn't a place that was kind of explaining the science to the non-PhDs. And I also realized there was a connectivity problem. Patients and caregivers felt very siloed from experts. And one appointment, if, every 6 to 12 months really wasn't enough to have the information that was required to live with Alzheimer's. And so that's really what set me on this path, was my mom's diagnosis.
And Ben, how about you? Any personal connection to Alzheimer's?
Yeah, absolutely. So my side of the family and also my wife's side of the family, we've had connection to it. My wife is actually a geriatric and Alzheimer's social worker, as Jim
Oh,
knows, working for Caring Kind,
right.
a great organization in New York City, working with patients that are newly diagnosed and their caregivers. But for me personally, on my side of the family, my uncle sadly passed away from an early onset form of Alzheimer's when he was 59, and was not recognized early on because of how young he was. He probably was showing symptoms starting in his late 40s, and it took a long time to really identify it and understand exactly what he was going through.
So I always think it helps to relate to our audience. And what you have here on the screen are three people whose lives have been touched, like our audiences have, by Alzheimer's and related diseases. So, Ben, I want to just jump in, and we hear a lot of talk about the new blood tests. Recently, we know that one was cleared by the FDA. And how are they going to change how people get diagnosed today?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So this was definitely one of the really exciting topics that was on everybody's mind at AAIC a couple of weeks ago. When we talk about diagnosing Alzheimer's, there's a lot that goes into that diagnosis. Certainly, providers seek to identify and confirm whether it's cognitive or functional impairment, some of the symptoms that are hallmark of dementia. And if they identify that, sometimes they'll start by trying to rule out some of the reversible causes, vitamin deficiencies or sleep issues, things like that. But if it's a confirmed dementia case, then the question is, what's the right root cause of it? Is it Alzheimer's or is it one of the other forms of dementia? And to confirm an Alzheimer's diagnosis, what you do is to look for one of the two hallmarks of the disease from a biological perspective. You've probably heard those people mention the amyloid plaques and tau tangles. Those are the clear signals of an Alzheimer's patient. And for years, the way that these were diagnosed was through either a PET scan or what we call CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, or it's more commonly known as a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. And those methods could diagnose the presence of amyloid or tau, but they both have limitations to them. PET scans are very expensive, but they also require very sophisticated machinery and are only available in very limited settings across the country. And so for many patients, they don't have access to them. And CSF, or the spinal taps, are less expensive, but can be seen as invasive for patients, and also do require some specialty training for providers to be able to administer them. And so we know that we need new ways to diagnose these patients, and we need more accessible and affordable ways to do that. And these blood tests are what's really exciting because they really tick the number of the boxes that need to be addressed. And so what these blood tests do is they test for those exact same proteins, amyloid and tau, but they look for them in the blood. And so just like you might get regular blood work done for your cholesterol or other tests, we could identify these Alzheimer's associated proteins in the same way. And the way that these kind of fit into the diagnostic process is in two main steps. One would be what we call a triaging tool. So what this is if patients have some initial concern and we want to figure out who are the right patients that should get sent on to see a neurologist, for instance, or who are the right patients that should go get that PET scan. A blood test can be a really useful tool to say, yes, you should go on for further testing, or no, we don't think this is Alzheimer's. You don't need to go on for that further testing. And given how limited the access is to PET testing and CSF, blood tests can be a really powerful tool to help make sure the right patients are going on to that follow-on care. But the other way that they can be used, which is also really exciting, is actually to confirm an Alzheimer's diagnosis. So for a neurologist, for instance, rather than having the patient get a CSF or a PET test, if they feel confident based on the full workup, they might only use a blood test to confirm that amyloid diagnosis, which is really important especially for starting patients on therapy, which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. But we saw some real data from clinicians who are doing this now in practice at AAIC, that they are using these tests to confirm an amyloid diagnosis, which is really exciting.
So are they expensive, Ben?
No, they're not as expensive as CSF and PET, which is great. The problem is that they're still new, and so we are still waiting for broad Medicare reimbursement for these tests. There's some specific tests have reimbursement in Medicare, but we'll have more clarity on that by the end of the year, how Medicare will cover these. And also for commercial plans, they have not yet sort of fully figured out how they're going to cover these, and so. We know a lot of patients right now are paying out of pocket, and obviously that's not ideal from a scalability standpoint, but they definitely are less expensive, in the hundreds of dollars versus tens of thousands for a
It's
PET
like
scan.
a few $100s. So, Deborah, are you hearing anything yet from patients and families about the availability of these tests?
So I have a couple things to say on this. We're getting a lot of questions, certainly, as more people find out about the blood tests. A lot of questions on our website have been, should I go get one? And it is a complicated question because it really depends on what stage the person is at. I mean, we've had people who have a lot of family members with Alzheimer's who have asked, should I go get a blood test, right? So it's complicated. And one person who is in our community had spoken to me, and I actually had a very long conversation with her because I thought this was an interesting case. She had, remember when Quest opened direct to consumer for like 3 months and then they were shut down and weren't able to go direct to consumer? There was a blood test that people could just take to tell them what their chance of Alzheimer's was, and risk, I should say. It was a risk profile. But this one woman happened to catch that window. She had a very high risk, is what it came back. And she went into PTSD because she thought, she didn't tell her family, she didn't tell anyone. She has Alzheimer's up the yazoo in her family. She's a homozygous E4. And she tried to get a PET scan with her neurologist. She wasn't able to even get a PET scan for about 5 months. So you can imagine the psychological torment that she went through. So that specific test, although there are very accurate tests now to market, that one Quest test was actually wrong. She got a PET scan. She didn't have amyloid in her brain. So why I bring this up is not that there's a risk that people are going to run out and get blood tests themselves, because they can't anymore. But it does highlight the complications in communication and what the patient really understands this means, right? There are, that actually opens the door to other problems that are existing on the neurology side. There are so many biomarkers that are coming out now, right? That frankly, physicians are confused as to what the accuracy is. This is moving really quickly, right? And we do have our first Fuji is our first FDA approved test, but there's other biomarkers that are coming and being tested all the time. So tracking that for a physician is really difficult. It's presenting a problem in the healthcare system. Now, my prediction is that we're going to have a contraction. We're going to have the tests that are going to win are the most affordable, approved by, the most accurate, affordable, and approved by insurance. And those tests are going to be the ones in the end. But we're in this period of time now where the innovation is nascent and more is coming online. And so that's confusing to neurologists. And in turn, that's confusing to patients, because how do the neurologists explain what's happening to patients and what test, frankly, that they're actually taking? A lot of times the patient won't even know that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Jim,
just
if I could just jump in go ahead, Jim. Yeah.
just speaking English. So PTSD, Deborah said that the patient went into PTSD, so they were very stressed. And a homozygote is somebody who has two copies of a very significant gene that increases significantly the probability that you will develop Alzheimer's. And Ben, can you speak? Deborah mentioned the bad time we had when Quest was available and then had to be withdrawn. How's the accuracy of today's Well, we know one has been cleared, not approved, but cleared by the FDA. So can you speak to that and that
Yeah.
concern?
Yeah, and Deborah raises a great point, which is, so our organization, CEOI, and also we had put out about a year and a half ago some consensus recommendations for how good these tests should be to be considered useful, how accurate they would need to be. And actually at AAIC, the Alzheimer's Association also put out guidelines, that were backed again by KOLs key opinion leaders and experts in the field, for how they could be used in specialty settings. And so we're starting to get consensus, I think, that there's standards that need to be met, again, around how accurate they need to be compared to those previous tests, CSF and PET, the ones that we mentioned before. And so we've created a database of how the tests that are out there in the marketplace actually measure up against those standards to try to make it easier for providers, just as Deborah was saying, that they don't necessarily have all that information at their fingertips. So we're trying to make that easy. But one of the really important things that Deborah touched on is just that, all of those recommendations from our organization, from the Alzheimer's Association, from others, do not recommend that people that are asymptomatic get these tests. So these should be, used for people that have symptoms that are, ordered by their doctor, is what the recommendations are right now. But we are seeing, companies that are popping up trying to sell these direct to consumer, and that's not what the recommendations are right now.
Yeah, if I could add to that though, it's kind of, I look at it like genetic testing in a way, right? It's like there are people out there who want to be proactive. So they want to know all the information, right? And so that's where we're getting a lot of questions. If you know you have a genetic relationship to Alzheimer's, there are some people obviously who don't want to know, and there are some people who do want to know. And the questions that we get tend to be the people who know that they're genetically predisposed, and they really want the full equation of their risk profile. And so I should clarify that, when we get those comments, it tends to be a very heavy predisposition. Now, there's other people who are asking about them just because they've heard about blood tests and thought, oh, is that something I should do? Right. So just to distinguish between comments that we get.
The other thing that I'm very excited about with these blood tests is that they are available and can be administered at the family physician at the front line. You don't have to wait a year to see a neurologist. These can be done immediately if you're symptomatic or have concerns, and it's great in that regard. But Deborah, how should one, so this is difficult, can be difficult information to receive. Do you have any thoughts on how patients should prepare themselves for the results? They're hearing the blood test results.
Well, I think the problem is that the blood test, the information that the patient is getting is like low risk, medium risk, high risk, right? But what does that actually mean? And so to me, that is more the neurologist and communicating to the patient what it means, because they're not going to understand the biomarker percentages and what that translates into. So I think this is critical for the medical, like whether it's a GP or a neurologist, really understanding how to explain these tests is crucial. And, we've done interviews. We interviewed Marwan Saba, who's a great neurologist, and we had him explain how he explains it to patients, because we thought that's really important information. It's not only the information that's coming from the test, but how do you communicate it to patients?
Thanks. Okay. Ben, we know that there's been remarkable progress in anti-amyloid drugs. We've had 2 approved, Kisunla and Leqembi, and there's real excitement about what I would call the next generation, or the evolution of these anti-MAB drugs. Can you tell us about that and what's happening there in the continuation of those drugs?
Yeah, so again, thinking back just a couple weeks ago to AAIC, I think there was a lot of exciting data that came out, both for the existing drugs, Kisunla and Leqembi, and also, as you say, the next generation. So for those existing drugs. So Kisunla and Leqembi are two approved drugs that are specifically designed to target amyloid in the brain and clear it from the brain. And they're the only drugs that we have that are available to actually slow the progression or modify the progression of the disease and not just treat the symptoms. So when these drugs are first approved, they're approved based on data that comes from clinical trials where we test their efficacy. And those trials run typically for, somewhere in between 1 to 2 years. And what we know is in the real life, the course of this disease goes on for many years. And so one of the exciting things that came out at the conference was there was data of the patients that were in those initial trials that were followed for longer. And what we saw was that they continued to see the benefit for the treatment, beyond that study period of the first 2 years. And so that's really important to know. And as the clinicians are treating the patients in these trials, and as they're treating now, patients in their actual practice, they're learning more about how to manage symptoms, who are the right patients, how to detect the symptoms, and so I think we're gaining much more information about how to actually deploy these drugs very effectively to patients, and that's very exciting. And there was also some data on these drugs that the manufacturers who are developing them are looking at new methods of administration. So right now, the drugs are infused, and patients have to go in anywhere from every 2 weeks to every month, typically, to receive infusions. And what we're starting to hear about are new formulations or new versions of the drug that are what are called subcutaneous injections. So rather than an infusion, you're getting just an injection after sort of initial period. So typically what we'll see is a patient may start on therapy with an infusion, but then eventually, as they maintain on the drug, they may just have injections. And so that would make these
At home.
at home potentially, yeah. So it's not approved yet. It's still just the early data that's coming out, but I think it's really encouraging to see that this may be a future avenue. So that was a lot of the excitement on the initial drugs. Again, continued safety data, continued efficacy data beyond those initial study periods, but then also potentially some new opportunities for how to administer them. So, and then, happy to talk too if you're interested about the next generation of drugs.
Let's hold that just a minute.
Yeah.
And what did we see about the effectiveness or the efficacy of the longer term information?
Yeah, so the efficacy continues to sort of grow, I would say, over the time of the course of the drugs. One of the things that we know, there's a lot of different ways these studies are analyzed at advanced statistics, but for patients, what we know matters most is time. How much time do you have? How much time can you save by being on one of these drugs? And there's a figure that's been sort of floating around in the community that these drugs can provide an extra 6 months of benefit. And they slow the progression of the disease by 6 months. But that 6 months was actually only over a clinical trial that was done over 18 months.
Right.
As I mentioned, usually about 1 year to 2 years. And so what we're seeing now is that benefit may be much greater than that 6 months, because if the patients are staying on the drug or seeing a benefit even longer, even when they may come off the drug, it may be a bigger benefit. And so that's, I think, what's really exciting is that the benefit may be even long, there may be a longer benefit than what was initially communicated, just because we didn't have the data at that time.
Deborah, those are good words for patients to hear. I know my wife was going for monthly infusions for 7 years on one of these drugs that was approved, and it's a big impact on lifestyle. What are you hearing from patients, one, about the challenges today with the administration of the drugs and their reaction to treatment, and how these new developments will be received in the patient community?
Okay, so I have 2 points of data on this. One is just to address what are the problems in the system. There are teething problems, of course, as when you're doing infusions, it's complicated, right? It's not just like, here's your prescription, go home, let us know how you're doing.
Take a pill.
It's infusions are hard. We've heard from members of our community that, they finally got approved to go on a monoclonal antibody, but their infusions they were having a hard time getting access to infusions. And so, a lot of that depends on where you live and how hooked in your neurologist or doctor is to infusion centers. So if you get approved, but you can't find a place to do the infusions, then what good is getting approval, right? So there's
Exactly.
these, and granted, these are new drugs. They haven't been around for a long time. So there is a normal expectation. But we're also hearing stories about people who say, I want to go on one drug specifically. We have one person who told us they wanted to go on Kisunla, and they were told that they had to prove that Leqembi failed twice before they put them on Kisunla. That's just wrong information. I have no idea where that's coming in, but we're hearing all these anecdotal stories, and it really points to problems in the healthcare system, right? But the other thing I wanted to mention is, and I thought this was a great data point as well, we launched late last year a survey on whether or not people are willing to take a genetic test for Alzheimer's. The amount of data we got from that survey, 2,105 people answered it. But what we learned and what was becoming very obvious is what neurologists are communicating to patients about the monoclonal antibodies and what are patients' preferences in terms of looking for therapeutics. So, to speak in generalities, a lot of times, especially the population with a genetic relationship, E4, ApoE4, they are being told in many cases to hold off because there's an elevated risk. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is like a lot of people, like Ben said, are asking us, when are the pills going to come out? When are the subcutaneous, and so the infusion itself is not an easy drug to be on. Now, granted, if there's no alternatives, then that's your alternative. But I do see there is a population of people out there who are taking a wait and see approach as the drug development continues, as administration becomes easier. I think it's just going to widen to more patients because it's not a simple process as much. I mean, I think a lot depends on where you're getting it. If you're at an academic institution that has infusion centers, it's a lot easier of a journey than it is if you live in a rural area and you have to drive hours, so there are different scenarios. One woman who was on Leqembi, she was living in the foothills of the Appalachian in Alabama, and she had to drive 2.5 hours to get her Leqembi infusions. And her husband had to take time off work to drive her. So it's not an easy road for everybody, right? And so I think as drug development evolves, as ways of getting these drugs becomes easier, we're just going to see more people on them, and therefore we're going to have better data on efficacy and results.
So this evolution that Ben's talking about to the subcutaneous at-home administration of the drug is really a great asset. And just to speak a little more, we know that there are two subgroups who have an elevated risk in using these MAB drugs, these two. And Ben, correct me here if I'm wrong, but we know that the homozygotes that Deborah mentioned earlier, individuals with two copies of the APOE4 gene, have an elevated risk of developing ARIA, which is a blood or liquid on the brain, which is the significant side effect. My wife was a double 4, did not have any problems in 7 years, but there is a greater percentage of those patients, even though it's a very small percentage of total patients, that they will develop ARIA. The second category is patients who are on anticoagulants. So a blood thinner raises the risk that you will have ARIA and bleed in the brain. So other than these two categories, it is not as risk, does not have a high risk profile, is how I would. Ben, did I characterize that
Yeah, I
close?
think that was a good
Okay,
characterization. I mean, obviously, these are very individualized treatment decisions that
right.
a provider would decide based on sort of the totality of the evidence for the patient and the risk, everyone's individual risk profile. And I think the key is that we want to have as many options as possible. So subcutaneous is another option, hopefully, for patients. We've also heard of patients who do like going to get the infusions because they've created a community now of people that they see every month or every couple of weeks at the infusion center if it's convenient to get to, as you mentioned, Deborah. So the timing, I think we're hoping that FDA has suggested they will respond to the application on Leqembi's subcutaneous formulation by the end of this month. So hopefully we'll hear if they stick to that timeline. We'll know very soon about this.
Great. So Jerry and I had many different clinical trial sites that we visited over our 7 years because we kind of moved around and stopped and started. But generally we drove 2 hours each way, once or twice a month. And it just became part of our life. It wasn't really viewed as a disruption. It was life for Jerry. And I always loved driving home because I used to joke that it was like having Madame Curie in the car. But, this was a clinical trial. It was still being tested. But she was so elevated in her mood because she felt she was right there looking into the microscope with the researchers. She was doing all she could to take care of herself but also to help the community. And it was really, as you've mentioned, Ben, really a wonderful time. And we had great care in all of the 4 different sites that we visited. But returning, Ben, where I kind of jumped the gun here, we've got a new generation coming and with some pretty exciting advances. Can you tell us about that and what that might mean for
Yeah.
the science?
So I think well, there's a phrase I think that we're pleased but not satisfied with the progress, and I think that best describes where we're at right now. And I think there's some really exciting, new innovations hopefully coming down the pipeline. There was a lot of excitement about a new potential drug called trontinemab. This is another drug that targets amyloid in the brain, like Leqembi and Kisunla do. But it has a really unique twist to it. So for many, if you think back to your high school biology class, you might have heard about the blood-brain barrier, which is a protective sort of barrier that helps protect the brain from infections and other things. But what that means is it's actually very hard to get pharmaceutical drugs also into the brain to target amyloid where we need it to. And so what this drug trontinemab has is what's called a brain shuttle. It's actually linked to a molecule that helps it transport across that blood-brain barrier. And the hope is that this means that this will be not only more effective, but also safer. And we saw some more data at AAIC that would suggest that, again, both of those in very early data, this is not a full-scale clinical trial yet. So we're not at a big kind of efficacy trial yet that they would get approval. But in the early data that they're seeing, they are seeing that it is very effective at clearing amyloid from the brain, perhaps even more effective than the existing drugs. And it looks like it may be safer. Now we need to figure out, does that safety profile continue when they test it in more patients? And does that clearing of the amyloid from the brain translate into benefit for cognitive and functional benefit for patients? But the early signals are really promising. And what really, I think, wowed everybody at the end of the session was not only are they studying this in symptomatic patients, but they're also launching a big trial now to study it in patients that do not yet have symptoms. So patients that may have elevated biomarkers for Alzheimer's, but we know that they may not develop symptoms for 5 or 10 years. They're going to test this drug in that population. So as really a prevention drug, not a treatment. And so I think that's where there's a lot of excitement, both for that drug, and there are other drugs that are also being tested in that population, including the existing treatments that we have today are both being tested in that early population, that what we call preclinical population. There's other drugs that are more like a vaccine. So what we call an active immunotherapy. This is something that might stimulate your own body to try to address and clear the amyloid or tau from the brain. There's also drugs that are targeting the tau molecule, not just the amyloid molecule. So a lot of exciting science. I think for a field that was just waiting and waiting for some breakthroughs, I think we're really starting to see the momentum start to pick up. So these will be, a few years away, but I think again a lot of excitement at the conference. You're on mute, Jim.
Thanks, Ben. Trontinemab, you talked about. Have we had any efficacy information? We know that it clears the plaque much more quickly. We know that it has so far much lower rate of the interest side effect, or much better safety profile, but we haven't really had any efficacy information yet, have we?
Yeah, the trials that they've done to date are smaller, so they're not really designed to measure the efficacy piece. So
Right.
I don't recall that there was any. Sometimes you get early signals. I don't recall
Right.
if we had that or not, but yeah, but right now it's mostly the biological data that looks very promising.
And so quite a variety there that you mentioned. One of the targets we've really wanted to move toward is combination therapy. As you see these different drugs reviewed, is there talk now of more combination therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to see those tested and determined what is most effective. This is, I think, still, several years away. But if we can also get drugs that target tau, so as I mentioned, these existing drugs that we have, Leqembi and Kisunla and trontinemab, all target amyloid. If we could complement that with something that targets tau, or there may be other parts of the pathology of this disease that we could target, I think that's where a combination approach becomes very attractive, because you're sort of addressing multiple pieces of the progression, but still
Deborah,
from that.
comments on this? Or I know you were there reporting every day, and reaction to these exciting follow-on developments
Well,
for.
I think what's really exciting, Jim, is the fact that we're seeing more people delve into prevention strategies, right? So New Amsterdam is, trying to get a cholesterol drug out in the market, and that would be mainly for preventative, right? So I think those types of alternatives are very attractive to a big subset of the patient population. Understanding biology, and I always pound on about this with my editorial team at Being Patient. We got to teach people about glucose metabolism, about cholesterol, how it relates to the brain, because that's where you get lifestyle impact, right? It is if you control these risk factors that we know are risk to the brain. So actually, looking at some of the medications that are being tested, the semaglutides, New Amsterdam is testing a cholesterol drug for more of the prevention. I think that's really exciting coming up. And just to kind of add to what Ben is saying, we always talk about Alzheimer's now as a multi-targeted approach, just like HIV, right? It's not going to be the magic pill that everyone had hoped way back when. Today, I think science is pretty much agreed on the fact that to stave off Alzheimer's or prevent it, it could take or to slow it down, I should say, it could take a multi-targeted approach. We're seeing the monoclonal antibodies aimed at beta amyloid. There's tau drugs that are being tested, inflammatory drugs, what will this look like in the future? And I think consensus right now believes it's going to be, you'll have maybe prevention medications if you feel like you're at high risk or on the road, and then if you're showing the pathology, it's perhaps more of a multi-targeted approach.
From your lips. It's just so much hope here. I love the mood now. When I started attending some of these conferences a decade ago, and the mood was much more somber, because we had had decades, literally decades, and billions of dollars of failures. And now we have multiple really bright spots. Deborah, I want to come back to one medication, but Deborah, you led us into one very important topic at the conference, and that was the results of the finger or pointer study about the benefits of a healthy lifestyle. Not really science so much as being tested by clinical trials to really validate whether or not a healthy lifestyle makes a difference. What did we learn there?
We learned that indeed it does make a big difference. There are so many aspects, and this is why I argue when people find out that they're at risk, that is the biggest motivator to adopt a healthy lifestyle. You heard me talk about our genetic survey, where a couple thousand people, it was unanimous that when people, those who did learn their genetic status and did have a genetic relationship, the first thing they did was change their lifestyle, right? And there's nothing better than risk to make people live healthier lives. That study that you're talking about, the pointer, finger, other place, it's known as the pointer here, finger study elsewhere, is just substantiates how lifestyle really does matter. Can we prevent dementia? In many cases, it is preventable. If you adhere and monitor and know what to monitor. I'm a big fan for constant glucose monitors. I did it, I'm a runner, but I did it as an experiment for myself. And what it does teach you is how you metabolize food. That's a critical foundation for a good diet. There are some things that spiked my glucose, like I'd eat a bowl of cherries and my glucose would go through the roof. I'd eat an acai bowl, my glucose would go through the roof. I'd eat a bowl of pasta and nothing would happen, right? So there's something to be said about the technology and the tools today that are available to us to monitor our own health, and therefore, as these studies are proving, kick the can down the road or prevent getting on the road to Alzheimer's.
Right. Ben, comments on?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we need as many, we talked about options before. We need as many options, or we need as many, arrows in the quiver as we can here to address this disease. And so I think we're absolutely excited about the data from that pointer study that talked about the benefit of lifestyle interventions. And we think that, it really proves the old adage of what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And so, absolutely, we want to see that, that approach be adopted more broadly. And as Deborah says, knowing that you have a high risk is a great motivator. But practically speaking, from a public health perspective, we also know that, the lifestyle interventions are sometimes, people don't adhere to them as much as they should, right? We all know we should eat better. We all know we should sleep better. And for those that are not familiar, that pointer study tested a very specific program, including a diet, exercise, making, there's other factors like smoking and things that need to be avoided, but it was a very specific program that people followed, primarily related to diet and exercise. And so, it's great. We want to support it, but we know that it alone may not be enough to address the amount of disease that we see coming. And that's where we think some of these therapeutic approaches to prevention can be really important. I think you both mentioned semaglutide, or what people know the brand name Ozempic. It's one of this new class of medicines you hear about called GLP-1s. There's later this year, so I think around November or December, we will get results from a major study called EVOKE that is testing this in Alzheimer's patients to see if there's a benefit. And I think there's great hope that if we can see a benefit by addressing people's cardiometabolic health, like the way that this drug does, it will be a tremendous benefit to the field, particularly because, as you talked about earlier, Jim, the value of trying to expand the prevention and care of Alzheimer's into primary care because of the constrained capacity of neurologists. That's a place, it's a drug that they are more familiar with and maybe more comfortable with prescribing if it shows a benefit. The one caveat I would say is that there's, that drug as right now is being tested in patients with Alzheimer's disease. I think, there's some questions in the field of whether that's too late to see an effect using that approach. And do you need to intervene earlier? And so if that data doesn't read out positive, we all hope it does. If it doesn't read out positive, I think there's still opportunity there, testing it in
Clinical.
populations, which is also happening.
So then went right to the next thing I wanted to mention, and that's this exciting clinical trial of repurposing a drug, Ozempic or Wegovy, that has been approved and we know has a good safety profile for diabetes and obesity. And family physicians prescribe this regularly. They know it's safe, they're comfortable with it. So if we had positive results on the effectiveness, the efficacy of these from the clinical trial, it'd be very exciting to add that to our toolkit. And it would be very exciting that we could begin to have treatment at the family physician. So if we have to wait a year to see a neurologist, we could be treating those patients during that time. And it's also would add another possibility to a potential combination treatment we mentioned a couple of times. So that to me is really, really a great possibility from a patient point of view. I wanted to move to something we haven't talked about or don't often talk about, and that's devices. We saw, and we're continuing, a couple of exciting devices. Deborah, do you want to? I know you've done some research there. Can you tell us about these new devices?
Yes, definitely. So these are non-invasive. They're wearable devices, depending on which one is being tested. Some use magnets, electricity, flickering lights, even sound to determine a couple things. One is, can they rewire brain activity? And the second thing is, can they clear amyloid plaques from the brain? So there's a couple that have been, in later stage testing. Cognitotherapeutics is one. They have been testing a headset that uses flashing lights and sounds, particularly at 40 hertz. Now, why 40 hertz is because at 40 hertz, for some reason, the technology is being tested to restore gamma oscillations. Gamma oscillations are in the brain, are an essential rhythm for neuronal communication. So this type of technology is being tested in animals. It's been very successful in terms of eliminating amyloid, but now Cognito is on to their phase 3 trial to look at is it the same in humans. They had, I think phase 2 covered about, I don't know, 75 people or something. And it showed promising results in phase 2 that slowing both functional decline and brain shrinkage over the course of about, I think around 6 months or so. So now the company is like running a larger phase 3 trial, and the results to that, I think, is expected at the end of 2026. The other company that's also testing is, you might have heard, transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is the other type of treatment which really targets a specific region of the brain and triggers neuroplasticity. It's basically used to help the brain form new connections and strengthen existing ones. And so it's kind of like an enhancer to help our brains with neuroplasticity. So these are really exciting in my opinion.
Synapticure.
Yeah. Yes. So these are really exciting to me because they're as easy as having a headset that you wear at home and while you're, walking around your house, or so that could be in the future. I mean, we're not that far away. Synaptica is in, I think, phase. They had a phase 2, and they're
Positive
planning on
results.
launching. Yes.
Yeah.
And they're launching phase 3 later in 2025. Cognito, which I mentioned earlier, is already into phase 3. So, let's wait and see what happens. Could be great news there. I mean, if you think about our conversation today and you think about the future of Alzheimer's therapies, it might be, oh, I need my cholesterol drug, and oh, here I'm gonna, while I vacuum my house, I'm gonna wear my headset. I mean, it sounds so futuristic, but the good news is we're not that far away from getting some of these answers. So I feel, very happy that we're now looking into a whole suite of offerings that potentially could look like the treatment of the future.
Very well said, and I share your excitement very much. And I think of pacemakers and what devices have been used in other very effectively in other disease areas. And I'm glad to see, although I sense some reluctance in the physician community to expand to include devices in their thinking, I think that's one of the things that we, Deborah and Voices of Alzheimer's, really need to do is continue the education that's necessary to the general public and the physician community on the effectiveness. Just like Ben has pointed out to me that really we need to work with the community in getting these blood tests integrated into clinical practice, both at the neurology level and at the family physician level. Ben, any comments on the
Yeah,
devices?
I think what gives a lot of hope here is, if you look at other disease areas, Deborah mentioned HIV earlier. I think, cancer is another place where I think we see precedent and some hope here. In cancer, it's very, frequent that a patient might have something like, say, radiation and then also chemotherapy, right? So it's a combination of approaches, and they're not all they're not all sort of therapies that you take or have infused. And so I think the hope is that we can have a similar approach here where, again, there might be different approaches, and this just allows for flexibility, and it allows to tailor the approach to the patient because every patient has different health conditions or genetic histories that they come with, and so we want to have options for patients. And I think these types of devices that you're talking about are great complements, and independent of the drug, they have great potential value. But if potentially used in combination, hopefully it could be even that much more effective.
Emily, are you there?
Hi, Jim. I'm here.
I'm not facile enough to keep up with the questions in chat. Can you help us there?
I sure can. There's been quite a lot of questions. Thank you all for being such an engaged group. I think I'm going to actually go back to our first topic because that's what we have overwhelmingly had, I think, the most questions on
Great.
around blood tests. And there's, I think, a common theme among our audience members. And I think we talked about it, but maybe just to dive deeper into it, we know that, clinical recommendations right now are really for people with symptoms. But maybe could we just spend some time explaining why that is? Why can't people that, don't have it yet, but maybe are at higher risk or have family history access this blood test? What was like the reasoning behind those key opinion leaders and others that made those decisions? And then if there's time, with that, what will it take for someone with elevated risk but no symptoms to get a blood test? Is it more research? Is it education? Kind of what's that gap there?
Ben, do you want to take that? Great
Yeah, I mean, I
question.
think there were a couple of factors that led to those recommendations. One is just based on where when you think about anybody going through a diagnostic process, the question is always what are you going to do with the information? And certainly there are lifestyle interventions that obviously people can implement regardless of whether or not they have symptoms. But the drugs that are approved today are only available for symptomatic patients. And so part of the recommendation was to align the testing to where the treatments are available. Now, that's not the only reason why we would do the diagnostic test, as I said. But I think one of the other barriers was just a data and an evidence gap as well. So the data for how accurate these tests are. Deborah talked about the importance earlier of false positives and even false negatives as well. Most of that data that we have to date is in patients who are symptomatic, and so the recommendations are also limited to that population in part because that's where we have the best data. Now, the two drugs that we have and some of the other products that are being tested in those earlier populations, while those clinical trials are going on to test the efficacy of the drug, they're also generating data on the use of these blood biomarkers in those populations too. And so I think as we start to see more data emerging about how accurate the tests are in that earlier phase, we'll hopefully start to see more recommendations and acceptance of their being used there.
Clearly, as patient advocates, we want that available to people pre-symptomatically as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But we also know that the FDA is cautious, and I won't make you say it off the record, but I will. But it would only be so there's no legal. It could be done off the I mean, off the off label. Some physicians might be willing to provide it to patients off label. Is that, Deborah? You're nodding your head there. Is that
No, sorry. I would,
a fair
no,
statement?
yeah, no, it wasn't applying to that. Sorry, I
Okay.
was thinking.
We of course do not recommend it, but at least that's sometimes a possibility. Emily, another quick question, and we will try to respond to the questions in chat that we aren't able to get to online afterward.
Emily, I noticed a few questions in the chat about just ApoE4 carriers and these new drugs that are being tested. So to the best of my recollection, I believe the trontinemab study does have ApoE4 homozygotes in the study. And so again, because of that improved potential for safety profile there, I think the hope is that it would be relevant for that population. But again, just too early to tell. I don't recall offhand if the semaglutide studies have ApoE4s or not, but I know that the trontinemab study does have ApoE4 patients in it.
Respecting our time, I know our experts have some commitments. Deborah, sorry.
Can I just say one thing, Jim? And this is
Sure.
a shameless plug for being patient, but one of the challenges that a lot of people impacted or, is keeping track of all of this. There's so much that's happening. And so that's really what we're trying to do at Being Patient. I mean, if you, and I'm going to give myself a shameless plug, we have a Friday newsletter. We're keeping abreast of the latest developments for you. If you want to know, what drug is in which phase, what it all means, that's what we're really trying to make easier for people. So please sign up for our newsletter and to stay really in the know, because that's what I found really overwhelming when my mom was diagnosed. It was hard to get this information in one place. You get bits and pieces of it, and it was really confusing. So really what we've tried very hard to do, and I think we're succeeding at, is just keep a tab on all of this for the non-PhD population and explain to them what it all means.
And explain to them at a level at which we can understand it. I think that's a great value, one of the many great values you brought to our community, Deborah, and we're tremendously grateful for that. Then start with you. Final thoughts, final takeaways from AAIC.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, this is, being in this field, I think you're sort of torn between, I think, two extremes. Is one is just, the challenge and the realities that patients today are facing, even those on therapy. I mean, it is still, we still don't have a cure for this disease. We still don't have anything that fully stops it. And so I think on the one hand, we're always grounded in that experience of patients today. But on the other end of that extreme, I think we're also very excited in a way that the field has not been for years or even decades. I think they're just, you mentioned how many, the tens of thousands of people at this conference. Just the number of people going is indicative of sort of the momentum in the field right now. I talked about cancer before. I think one of the things that you see often in cancer is a first drug that proves that you can target a specific type of therapy it's not the last drug, but it's the proof that it's possible. And then you always try to improve on that scientifically. And I think the hope is that we're going to do the same thing here. We know these drugs that exist are a major leap forward, but there's still much more that can be done. And I think it's, there's just more, there's so much more excitement now that we're on the right track. And so, we'll keep pushing forward.
Well said, Ben. Thank you. And thank you for being here today. Deborah?
So my key takeaways are, diagnostics are going to get a lot better and a lot easier for patients. That's a great thing. I think I'm a believer in knowing earlier is better. You have more control if you know earlier. I think, the pipeline is exciting of more alternatives for patients. I think it's a very much a wait and see attitude, but I really do think that we will be seeing not only new drug therapies, but we will also be seeing different administration, like we talked about ditching the IV. I think that's, the future, hopefully for people, making it easier for patients. And just technology is leaping forward. Artificial intelligence is giving us the ability to do things in a way that we haven't, whether it's analyzing data sets, right? It's amazing what's going on. So I really do feel optimistic. I think we're going to see more data on lifestyle as these studies continue, as technology gets better, tracking voice, tracking typing, things like that. So I think, the future looks exciting to me. We're changing the definition of what it's like to live with a diagnosis. And I say live because I think that's how people are going to see it in the future. So I think it's very exciting.
Tremendous. Thank you, Deborah. Tremendous. Thank you, Ben. It's really been a great hour. Tremendous. Thank you to our audience for tuning in today. Remember that this will be available on our website. It's been recorded, and direct any friends here. Our challenge is education, educating the public, educating physicians when they're asked by their patients to know what the science is bringing us, what the new possibilities are. Please join us next quarter when we'll have another webinar. We'll try to match these two great experts, but it'll be hard. Thank you both again, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Jim. I should just say, someone asked, the website is beingpatient.com. You can sign up for our newsletter there. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jim.